Capita envisions a future in which children and families can flourish. By prioritizing our youngest children, their families, and their communities, we have the potential to radically transform the fabric of our societies for the long term. In this series of Capita in Conversation, we talk to interviewees from around the world to hear their stories, knowledge, wisdom, and ideas on how to create child and family flourishing. In this episode, Capita Senior Fellow Elliot Haspel interviews Brendan Ballou, author of Plunder, Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America. They discuss the basics of private equity and its differences from venture capital firms and hedge fund investments. They outline the risks of private equity on the human services and childcare sectors. Finally, they touch on policy solutions and how individuals can work with advocacy groups to address these risks.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us. I am here with Brendan Ballou and really excited for this conversation. Brendan is the author of Plunder, Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America, and he served as Special Counsel for Private Equity in the Justice Department. And if you've been following my work at all in childcare, you know that the issue of private equity in childcare is one that I care deeply about and that I am deeply concerned about. So to have an expert like Brendan on is fantastic, and I'm looking forward to unpacking some more about this question of what is private equity and how does it influence the childcare sector. So, Brendan, can we start with the basics? Can you just briefly define private equity and how does it differ from, say, a venture capital firm or a hedge fund or these other financial groups that we hear about?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for having me. And I should say off the top that I'm speaking in a purely personal capacity here. But what you're asking is a really good question, because I think private equity is a term that we've all heard, but frankly, we don't really know what it is. And I didn't know what it is until I was pretty far into researching the issue. So just the very basics, a private equity firm uses a little bit of its own money, some investor money, and a whole lot of borrowed money to buy up companies. It then tries to make financial or operational changes to the companies that it buys with the aim of selling it for a profit a few years later. So it's a very simple business model, but for reasons that I'm sure we'll get into, it creates, because of sort of the laws and regulations around it, a lot of bad incentives that can lead to disaster for the companies, for the customers, for employees, pretty much everybody except the private equity firm. Now, to get to your specific question on what distinguishes a private equity firm from a hedge fund or a venture capital firm, it's a really good question. And I will say that these lines are somewhat permeable. Somebody or a firm that might describe itself as a private equity firm may engage in hedge fund-like activities. A venture capital firm might engage in something like a leverage buyout, which is what private equity firms do. But very briefly, a private equity firm is different from a hedge fund in that a hedge fund tends to invest in public securities, so stocks, bonds, commodities like oil and coal. Private equity firms don't buy stocks, they buy whole companies. They'll buy Sears, Toys R Us, apartment complexes, veterinary clinics, and so forth. And then finally, to wrap up the answer, venture capital sort of sits to the adjacent to both of those in that it tends to make equity investments, non-controlling investments in smaller companies with the hope that some percentage of them are going to turn out fabulously successful. So it's a little bit like buying a lottery ticket, whereas being a private equity firm is sort of like buying the whole convenience store.
That makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate that. And I think understanding those lines of distinction make it a little clearer with the different, some of the different incentives that you're talking about and some of the different profit motives. And so with private equity, buying up entire companies and making these operational changes in the sort of goal of wanting to sell them off down the line. One thing that I think is interesting is we're talking in childcare about a human service sector, right? So it's not Toys R Us. It's not, a movie theater chain. It's a very much a human service sector. It's not the only human service sector that private equity has been involved in. Obviously, nursing homes is a good example. I know that from your book, they been involved in prison services. They've been involved in autism services. And so can you tell us a little bit about the history, like what have for private equity's consequences been in those sectors, and what might that suggest for their involvement in childcare?
Absolutely. So private equity firms have been involved in all of the industries that you just mentioned. In prisons, they have been buying up prison phone services, cafeterias and commissaries. And the results there have been, as alleged, pretty disastrous. You have situations where a 15-minute call might cost $15 or more. A situation where prisoners are being served that food that allegedly has mold and dirt on it, meat that is literally labeled not fit for human consumption. And then you have healthcare services in prisons where, as alleged, a private equity-owned healthcare provider did not provide service to a woman who ultimately had to give birth by herself alone in her jail cell. And that's just one of many stories. There are sort of similar stories across these different service sectors. When you're talking about nursing homes, there's now a famous study that estimating that private equity ownership is responsible for perhaps 20,000 premature deaths in nursing homes over a 15-year period. And in autism care, there's some great reporting just out by Gretchen Morgensen talking about private equity firms buying up autism service centers, and not only the prices skyrocketing, but also the quality of care declining, the amount of training for employees falling as well. To get to your question, what attracts firms to these industries? Well, I think it's two things, one sort of global and then one specific. The global issue is that because of the laws around the private equity industry that allow it to extract fees from companies that are hard to recoup in the bankruptcy process, that allow it to lever up a company with a lot of debt to buy the company that the company is responsible for, not the private equity firm, and a host of other reasons, private equity firms tend to be able to capture the upside of a deal when a business succeeds, but walk away when something goes poorly. And so that incentivizes something of a short-term extractive approach to a lot of businesses. And I think we see that across the care economy, as it's been reported at least. The more specific issue for some of these industries is I think private equity firms tend to be attracted to businesses that have steady cash flows and often have steady cash flows from the government, Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth. And, when you're thinking about nursing homes where a lot of residents are paying the nursing home through Medicaid money. Similarly, with prisons where you have government contracts that allow them to set up shop in a cafeteria or commissary. These are areas where you have steady cash flow coming in every day, every week, every month that allow the private equity firm to finance the debt from the transaction and allow it to keep going.
Makes sense. And, it's interesting as I've been doing my own the research and reporting into childcare. In a lot of cases, it seems like these private equity backed chains are not yet serving large percentages of children receiving public money because that public money isn't particularly robust. But instead, they've been focusing more on affluent clients because there seems to be a lot of captured demand, right? They're focusing on using the real estate assets of these programs. But what you're saying is that we might plausibly expect as more and more public money starts going into childcare and the flow of public money becomes more attractive, that it might be of interest to private equity firms to expand and try to capture more of that public funding. Is that a fair kind of assertion of what might be one plausible future?
I do think that's fair in that I think private equity firms, like all industries, are attracted to where the money is. And the more government investment there is in childcare, I think the more attractive this industry is going to be for private equity.
Gotcha. No, that's helpful. I'm curious, when you're thinking about the different kind of strategies that the private equity firms tend to use to make money, because this is the question that I always get is, well, childcare is a famously difficult industry not one that people tend to make money. Like, how are they making money? One thing that you seem to be bringing up too is that they're good at finding the places where you can squeeze some money out of it, and with the short term nature of it. So, is that I guess, to what extent does that pose threats to the systems more broadly? This idea of, I'm going to be in for 3 to 7 years and then sell it off to someone else, like that sort of short-term churn. What have we seen in other industries and the impact of that? And I'm thinking specifically on the end users, on the workers, those types of individuals.
I think you're exactly right that how long these firms invest in the company changes their perspective on the business. If you're investing for years or decades, you're going to think about, how do I invest in my infrastructure, in my employees, in my relationships with my customers? Whereas if you're going to own a business for 3 years, you're really going to be focused on, how can I cut costs as quickly as possible? And that is especially acute in a situation where private equity firms are often very effective at insulating themselves from liability for the consequences of their actions. So, an example that I turn to often was Carlisle's acquisition of the nursing home Manor Care. When a resident died in an allegedly understaffed facility, the family sued Carlisle, but Carlisle was able to get the case against it dismissed by saying it wasn't the technical owner of the nursing home. Rather, it just advised some funds whose limited partners through several shell companies owned the nursing home chain. And it's possible that you're going to see a similar dynamic happen in childcare, which is funds affiliated with private equity firms may buy up childcare services. They may have, again, this is speculation, but it's based on what we've seen happen in other industries, may reduce the quality of care, cut training, cut services, cut staffing, and so forth. And because of the short-term perspective and because of the insulation from liability, if something bad happens at a child care center, it will be very hard to hold the private equity firm responsible. And so I think that's illustrative of how private equity firms can capture the upside when things go well and walk away when they don't. And it's possible, at least, that will happen in childcare.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And we saw a version of that, I know, in the Netherlands when I was reporting, when the largest chain in the Netherlands went under as private equity owned, and they basically managed to sell it off to another group, came in, snapped it up, but they sold off all the unprofitable centers and just sort of doubled down on the profitable pieces, and no one really took any consequences for that. None of the actual firms involved, the private equity firms, ended up having much of a consequence, even though it was very damaging for the employees, for the families involved. Do you think, one thing that I hear sometimes, and I think I want to be fair to the sort of industry and the sector we're talking about, is that childcare is less of a threat to some extent than the place like nursing homes, because there are fairly stringent regulations already in place. So, for example, there's a fight going on to input, minimum nurse to patient ratios in nursing homes. My understanding is that's sort of a battle, but in childcare, there are already in place minimum, adult to child ratios. So does the more regulated nature of childcare make it, does it afford any protection, do you think?
Perhaps yes and no. I think it's certainly helpful that many of these protections already exist. I think one of the challenges that you have with private equity, I was just talking earlier with some folks about private equity in housing, where they are buying up large tracts of single-family homes, turning them into rentals, buying up multi-unit apartment complexes. And what I was saying is, private equity, mom and pop landlords, for instance, I don't want to overly valorize them, because we've all, lived in an apartment where the landlord refused to fix the sink or whatever it happened to be. But private equity firms in housing have a huge advantage that mom and pop don't, which is enormous lobbying power. And you see that in the housing sector, where Blackstone and others were able to successfully lobby to prevent tenant protections in California from being extended to single-family rental homes. And what that says to me is that one of the unique abilities of the private equity industry, because it has invested, along with investment firms, I believe over $900 million over several decades to federal and state candidates, for instance, and elected officials. The fact that it employs former secretaries of state, defense, treasury, and the list goes on of sort of luminaries in government working for private equity. Yeah. Because of all these powers, I think private equity sometimes is actually attracted to more highly regulated industries because they are areas where private equity firms are able to exercise pretty unique levels of influence and impact. Mm-hmm. So all of which is to say that I think it's probably helpful for the childcare industry that many of these regulations exist. But I think also looking at what's happened in other industries, that isn't necessarily a reason to feel relief or necessarily safety as the finance industry moves into this business.
Yeah, no, that's very sobering to think about. And, there's a line to put a fine point in it. I quote it all the time from Plunder, that the Congress works for few constituencies harder than it works for private equity. And indeed, we've seen, private equity-backed chains, allegedly be involved in various political activity that seems to be misaligned with some of the goals of universal childcare, or, groups like Bright Horizons used to be private equity, now it's publicly traded. Are stated very clearly in their SEC documents that if there's any sort of broad-based government support of childcare that lowers the costs, it's going to be bad for them, or that forces them to pay their educators better. So that is, I think, this interesting dynamic around the politics, where it's not clear that the private equity-backed for-profit chain part of the sector it is really fully aligned with the rest of the sector when it comes to the goals of a system that works well for all kids, all families, all educators.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I want to switch into sort of talk a little bit more about what can be done through the last bit of this conversation. So, and I want to take that both in two ways. From a policy perspective, like what are some actions that can be done, and I want to talk about for any stakeholders on the ground that are listening right now. If you're an early childhood educator, if you're a director, if you're working on state advocacy, like what sort of things individuals might do. But let's start at the higher level. So what sort of actions can be taken to defend against the excesses of private equity, to kind of put guardrails in place so that those short-term profit motives don't end up causing bad outcomes for those on the ground?
It's a great question. So I've always thought that there are three basic challenges with the private equity business model. And I think we've alluded to a lot of them over the course of this conversation. One is that private equity firms tend to invest in the short term, as you said. Another is that they tend to rely on debt to buy their companies, debt that the company has to pay, not the private equity firm, and that they're able to extract a lot of fees, which incentivize sort of an extractive model rather than an investment one. And then finally, what we were talking about earlier, that private equity firms are very good at insulating themselves from legal liability. If you change those three things, if you dial those down, private equity becomes a much less extractive part of our economy, maybe becomes a productive part of it. The challenge is how to do so. Now, there are things that we can do at the federal level. Obviously, Congress can pass laws. There are things that federal regulators can do, like the Securities and Exchange Commission, Treasury Department, Federal Reserve, and so forth. But there's also a lot that can be done at the state and local level. One of the things that I've always wanted to see is local, cities and states thinking about, okay, we're not going to ban certain tactics by private equity firms, sale leasebacks, dividend recapitalizations, other sort of complicated maneuvers. But if a private equity firm does one of those things in our jurisdiction, and 12 months, 24 months, 36 months down the line, employees lose their jobs, customers are harmed, the business goes under, what have you. We as the state or city are going to make sure that the private equity firm is legally and financially responsible for the consequences. And if you do that, if you make private equity firms responsible for what they do in a state or in a city, I think you're going to see them behaving a lot more responsibly. So I think one of the challenges for activists over the next few years is developing both sort of the intellectual foundation for that sort of policy and then the political or coalition foundation for it to help make this, not just into an idea, but into a law.
Thank you. I appreciate those thoughts. I think that leads sort of into the next question. I will say too, it's interesting you bring that up because I just saw this morning Massachusetts, their budget came out of conference, and they have really the first state that I've seen put really strong conditions and guardrails around public money going into a way that private equity firms or large for-profit chains in this case, which are mostly private equity backed, can access those public money, that's state money. And so there are conditions, they like limiting any given chain can't get more than 1% of this pool of grant funds. They have to agree to and enroll, students receiving subsidy. They have to spend a certain percentage of their grant funds on educator salaries. They have to do an annual audit and talking about how they spent their funds, which is more than just a basic community or mom and pop program have to do. And so I do think that it's really true that states are where a lot of this action seems to be happening, and it's encouraging to me to see states like Massachusetts start to lay out some precedents of what you can use, and also just how do you define, to your point, like instead of just saying we're going straight after private equity, like for example, Massachusetts, they say if you're a for-profit company, you have more than 10 sites in our state, you're defined as this class of large for-profit provider, which ends up basically capturing all the private equity-backed chains. So I think there's some creative solutions starting to come out in the childcare space.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So my last question then is, okay, so you kind of alluded to this again, but for the people who are listening in, who are doing this work day in and day out, like what can individuals be doing?
Yeah. I have my thoughts on sort of what the right policy solutions are. I'm not a childcare expert. I focus on private equity sort of generally. But there's a whole coalition of people that are working on these issues, whether it's Americans for Financial Reform, the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, the American Economic Liberties Project. All these folks are doing interesting and important work, and I'd encourage folks to just get on their listservs and see what's going on. I'll also say just personally, I'm not hard to find. If you want to talk about policy proposals, there are some limitations on what I can talk about, but to the extent I can, I'm more than happy to do. I'm on Twitter, I've got an email on there. Feel free to reach out, and I'm more than happy to do what I can, because I really do think that to the extent that there's going to be reform on private equity and private equity tactics over the next few years, it's really going to be driven by grassroots organizing and by folks working at the state and local level. That's where the real frontier of change is.
Yeah, that's great. And yes, and that's at Brendan Ballou, just so BrendanBallou for those who are listening in on Twitter. And so, Brendan, thank you again. Thank you for all the work you've been doing. I cannot tell you how many people I've recommended Plunder to, and I will say, again, for anyone listening, Plunder, Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America, you need to get it, read it. I often say don't read it when you have things that are breakable close to you. And it's really, really eye-opening. So thank you for all your work you've done. And I, look forward to continuing our conversations in the future.
Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it.
Each episode of Capita in Conversation is produced by Michael Bettis and is available by podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as capita.org.